And then in the 20th century, the federal government moves its wealth or asset building processes away from land acquisition to home ownership. And even then, there's a discriminatory application of those laws in such a way that whites enter into the middle class as a consequence of the Federal Housing Administration's policies as well as the GI Bill, while blacks are disproportionately denied access to that same middle class position. So the wealth gap is something that was created by public policy, and hence public policy should be mobilized for the purposes of reversing.
And we should say that that's the abridged version, right? I mean, we can also go and talk about those same massacres that were also attacking the political power of
That's correct.
Black people during Reconstruction, which ultimately leads to more decisions, cascading a series of decisions that will also disaccumulate wealth for Black people and accumulate wealth for white people. We've spoken to Annalisa Cox about her book Bone and Sinew, about 10,000 Black farmers in what was then the Northwest Territories, Ohio and that area in the, I think it was the 1830s, where laws were passed to basically strip these Black farmers of their land. We could go on and on.
Yeah. I mean, states like Oregon literally could be described as sundown states because they had laws that excluded the entry of Black people into the state.
And I guess one could also argue that there's a knock-on effect to those 160 acres and to the resources that people as you go.
I'm sorry, you handled that so beautifully the first time. I don't know. I think they're testing the
fire alarm,
testing the alarm system at my home.
Oh, I thought that was when you thought I got something particularly right.
No.
Particularly wrong.
Particularly wrong.
I don't have a buzzer at my desk.
All right. So if we get to that point where we like, at what point how do we start to delineate between, and maybe this is splitting hairs, but I think ultimately we start getting into the realm of the political implications of this. But when do we stop looking at the implications of Black decumulation of wealth or white accumulation of wealth that are a part of the same lineage of slavery versus, let's say, like FHA loans in World War, in the 50s and the 40s, or the GI Bill, or we spoke to Dorothy Brown the other day about the tax code. Like that would impact maybe folks who don't have descendants of slaves. I mean, what is there any point? Because I mean, I think it seems to me this lineage of wealth decumulation for Black people continues today, right? I mean, this isn't necessarily historical. I think there was a report that just came out a couple of weeks ago that showed Black boys will necessarily, as adults, if you look at Black boys and Black and white boys as children, regardless of where they live, there'll be a wealth disparity between them 20 or 30 years out. And so this has been ongoing. At what point is there a cutoff in terms of when we're talking about reparations and move into a sort of, we have inequalities in society that we need to deal with? At what point are the reparations temporally for?
Yeah, well, so I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, I certainly think that there's a host of inequalities in the society that lead to disadvantages for large numbers of people, whether they are Black, white, Asian, or Latino. And those are disadvantages that need to be corrected. And so as a consequence, I'm an advocate of a set of policies that come under the label of an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which would be inclusive of things like a federal job guarantee, national health insurance, and so forth. But there is an outstanding debt that has never been paid to Black Americans as a consequence of the failure to meet the promise of 40 acres at the end of the Civil War. And that's a community that merits specific consideration with respect to American national policy. And so I think we do both is my position, but they are not the same policies. A policy of reparations for Black Americans that addresses the racial wealth gap is something that's quite distinct from a set of policies that are universally applicable to all Americans, because not all Americans have experienced the cumulative multi-generational effects of white supremacy.
And I guess that's the part I'm asking about, is in terms of like who is qualified for that narrow set of what we call reparations. Is that specifically descendants of slaves, or is it expanded, or is it a different group of people?
So in the work that we've done, it's been there's been a specific focus on Black Americans who are descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And that's because that's the community that has had to bear the burden of the cumulative effects of slavery, legal segregation in the United States, and then ongoing atrocities like mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, sustained discrimination in employment, housing, and credit markets. What I'd like to emphasize is that in the present moment, there's approximately 45 million Black people in the United States, 10% of whom are immigrants of more recent origin in the United States. And the vast majority of those, upwards of more than 9% of those, are individuals whose families arrived after the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, and then more specifically, post 1980 or so. So we're talking about a very, very small number of folks who are not descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States, who were living in the United States during the Jim Crow years. And so I think the focus has to be on those folks whose ancestors came here enslaved rather than other folks who might have come here under different circumstances. We can distinguish, I think, in an important way between involuntary and voluntary immigrants. What constitutes reparations and what doesn't? I mean, is it? Do we basically? It's just we're going to cut a check, and that's really the only legitimate, thing that we could call reparations. And if that is the case, what's the mechanism to distribute it? I guess it's. I mean, we figured out how to cut checks over the past year or so. So, I mean, also during the Great Recession as well. Yeah. And I would also say, if I remember correctly, George W. Bush sent out a couple of $200 or $300 checks in 2004 or 5, I think it was. But So is that basically it? It has to be a check. That's not. We're not going to invest in like. Grants, colleges, community centers or something. It's a check. So there's a difference between trying to address this indirectly and trying to address it directly. And, we're convinced that the indirect approaches are not going to turn the trick. So, for example, if you invested in a greater level of college education for Black Americans, well, that's confounded by the fact that Black Americans who are heads of household with a college degree have $20,000 less in net worth than white Americans who are heads of household who never finished high school. So the education route as an indirect step towards equalizing the racial the racial gap in wealth is not one that will work. And I think that's there's a general problem with social programs because they're not going to be precise enough in terms of who they reach. So, for example, if you have some neighborhood level project or initiative, or if you have some citywide project or initiative, given rapid gentrification in the United States, you have no assurance that the resources are going to go to the population that merits them. So our thinking is that this does have to be done in a direct fashion. I think it's a little more subtle than talking about cutting a check, however, because it's not necessarily something that has to be done by making a direct transfer of cash. You could do it by providing people with less liquid assets, like an annuity, a trust account, or some other type of endowment, or some combination thereof. But I think it's essential that direct payments be made to eligible recipients.
So what do you perceive? I mean, obviously, there is simply the pure sort of justice aspect of it, right? I mean, the concept of reparations are not. This is not a newfangled idea. Germany made reparations to specific Jewish families and to Jewish organizations. In the wake of the Holocaust, we have our whole legal system is really, in many respects, set up. When we talk about torts, damages have been done, and you go in and you win an award of damages. I mean, on some level, that's what reparations are basically. This is one big tort case, right? I mean, in many respects, isn't it? And,
and there's also an American precedent. I mean, a very, very very direct precedent, which is the provision of U.S. government payments to Japanese Americans who were subjected unjustly to mass incarceration during the course of World War II. And there are also instances where the U.S. government has made payments for reparative purposes when the U.S. government was not the perpetrator. So one example. One example is the $4.4 million payments that were made to the individuals who were held hostage in Iran. Another example are the payments that were made to families that lost loved ones during the course of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So, yeah, we do have precedents for doing this beyond the court system, precedents in terms of the United States government actually making these types of payments.
And is so much of the reluctance to it just based on, one, the scale of it, but also the justification that was consistently used during slavery and afterwards, that it was essentially benevolent, right? That slaves were being civilized and were being seen the true light by being enslaved, and were better off than being in Africa. And then just the remnants and the through line of that kind of thinking still being so present in the conversation.
Yeah, in our book, we actually talk about the nation's failure to deconfederatize. And we contrast this with what took place in post-World War II Germany, albeit not entirely satisfactorily. But post-World War II Germany, to a large extent, did undergo a process of denazification. But the traitorship that was associated with the formation of the Confederacy never has been something that's been addressed in a way in which the Confederacy has been portrayed as anything else than a somewhat dignified attempt to preserve states' rights, rather than a wholly traitorous attempt to maintain slavery in the United States. And so, as a consequence, there's a through line to attitudes about Black Americans and attitudes about reparations that are consequent of the maintenance of the vision of American society that's been preserved by the acolytes of the Confederacy. And so, you're absolutely right that that's something that also has to be addressed. And we talk about a component of a reparations program in our book that would involve an educational project for 3 generations